Okay, let's look at some more things we can do with monetary policy. And in particular this time, let's do a strange example where we run things in reverse. So let's draw our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, long run aggregate supply, short run aggregate supply, aggregate demand. And let's think about an example here where something goes really well. For example, let's imagine the government spends a whole bunch of money trying to stimulate the economy and shifting the aggregate demand curve out. Well, the central bank is going to look at this and say, look, Ottawa, we understand what you're doing. You are using the government money to stimulate the economy unsustainably. You are pushing out aggregate demand and raising prices. But we're the central bank, and we want to maintain price stability, right? We have this 2% target. We don't want you pushing up prices like just happened. So if we're the central bank, imagine that we have a goal to keep prices roughly stable. Well, the central bank might shift the aggregate demand curve back to get back to the original price level. In order to do that, we would be manipulating the money supply and contracting the money supply, right? Contracting money supply. We're pushing interest rates up here. And we're also pushing the Canadian dollar up behind the scenes. This is the cause of a lot of disagreements between the federal government and the central bank. The federal government and the central bank might not have the same goals in mind. Here, the federal government wants to stimulate the economy, and it might want to stimulate the economy in an unsustainable way because, say, it has short-term objectives in mind. Maybe it wants to win re-election, and so the government doesn't care about the future inflation that it's causing. It only wants to boom the economy now to make its election chances so much better. But the government might not feel the same way about the future as the central bank. The central bank might have a longer-term view, and they might say, look, you're going to cause inflation if you keep doing this. We need to make sure that we don't let this inflation get out of control, right? If the central bank doesn't do anything, we're eventually going to end up here at this long-run aggregate intersection with a whole lot of prices, and the central bank is smart enough to see that coming. And so they might undo the effects of the government stimulus. This is why governments and central banks can be at loggerheads with each other. They both manipulate aggregate demand curves, so if they're not on the same page about what society's goals are, they sometimes move in opposition. Sometimes this is good. In the situation I've drawn here, the government probably shouldn't be using money to stimulate the economy unsustainably in a way that's only going to generate inflation, and the central bank is right to undercut them, right? If we stay at the long-term equilibrium, we keep being at full employment and we don't generate the inflation. But in other situations, it might be the case that we really need to expand output. Maybe we're in a recession, and the central bank and the government should be trying to do the same thing, as opposed to here where they're at loggerheads. We can see that a little more in depth if we switch to doing a example where we've got a short run supply shock. Let's think about a case where we've got, again, aggregate demand, short run aggregate supply, prices and output, and we have some example where the short run aggregate supply curve is going to go up. This is the classic problem for governments, right? We say, look, here prices are rising and we don't like that. But we also don't like the recession. We've got two bad things on our hands, right? We don't want the prices to go up, and we also don't want there to be a recession. So government might try to do one thing. Government might try to cure the recession, and the government might try to push aggregate demand this way. But the central bank might try to do the other thing. The central bank might say, look, we really care about price stability. We want to make sure that we shift aggregate demand back the other way so that we get price stability. You can again see where the central bank and the federal government are going to be at odds. And it all comes down to their preferences. Here, the government cares about output more than prices. And so the government is saying, let's raise prices and fix the recession. Here, the central bank is saying, well, we don't care as much about the recession, we really care about price stability. The central bank says, let's have an even bigger recession at Y2, but let's keep inflation where we think it should be. Well, who's going to win? It comes down to who's willing to shift aggregate demand the furthest. How much money the government is willing to spend versus how much money the central bank is willing to print, and how effective those things are, right? We know that the monetary transmission mechanism is complicated, and so you can't exactly compare these things on a dollar for dollar basis. But situations like this are really important for society to sit down and think about. As a society, is it better for us to focus on inflation, or is it better for us to focus on output? Because when we shift the aggregate demand curve, those are the things that we always have to trade off against each other, and reasonable people can prefer one of them over the other.